Well, first of all, I don't accept that the Church Fathers created the canon. I think that's entirely the wrong category. In fact, it's the wrong category by their own talk about the books of the New Testament. Rather, they were convinced that God had given some documents that were as inspired, as authoritative, as binding as Old Testament books that were already recognized. And the question is, how do you recognize them? How do you recognize them over against competitors? So it wasn't as if the Church Fathers were going around asking, shall we create a bunch of authoritative documents and call them the canon? Rather, they were asking, granted that God has given us certain materials that we all recognize, what is the limit of those materials? And they developed certain criteria. Those criteria were fundamentally three. The first was, is the material apostolic? Now, by that they didn't necessarily mean it had to be written by an apostle, one of those first designated by Jesus, but it either had to be written by an apostle or be associated with an apostle in some sense, within a full generation. So Mark's Gospel, for example, was known to be connected with Peter. Luke was known to be connected with Paul, and so forth. But they were trying to preserve the central place of the first witnesses who were in living contact with Jesus himself, rather than allowing a long succession of later narratives to come on board. So when you start dealing with the Gospel of Peter and this sort of thing, a second century document without any living connection with Peter, long beyond the time of the apostolic period, one of the reasons why it's not accepted is because it doesn't meet the first criterion. And then second, the question was always raised, has this always been universally recognized throughout the church? That is to say, is it just some sort of local thing that's been built up by some sort of aberrant group in Egypt, let's say, or in Babylon? Or is it instead something that is massively accepted by the whole church? And you have to recognize that sometimes some documents took a little longer to be accepted in other places. They recognized that too. But that was an important criterion too, so that it was not just a parochial judgment. And then third, they wanted to ask, is this in line with the gospel that we have understood, with what has already been passed down in the documents that are already accepted, in the teachings that the first apostles recognized? Is this something that that is in line with that, or is it different? Now, the possibility of false documents being circulated was recognized from the earliest period. Paul himself warns the Thessalonians that sometimes people were even using his name, trying to claim some authority when it wasn't really valid, which is why even when he dictated his letters, he made sure he signed it himself, the signature by the hand of me, Paul, so I write in all my letters. So the question of authentication was pretty important, and the church tried to handle it pretty well. But that doesn't mean that the authority rests in the church. The church merely came to recognize a packet of documents that God himself had given. That is the way it seems to me that it should be worded. And to think of this as a massive conspiracy in which a lot of priestly people in Rome or someplace picked and chose in order to get rid of a whole lot of false teaching, has really got the history all backwards. It's been touted this way for a long time, as if the first teaching structure of the early church was massively diverse and variegated and so on, and gradually became narrower and narrower as the Orthodox, those nasty right-wing bigoted people, finally cut off Gnostics and other kinds of things. The history is just distorted when it's put like this, and it has been answered again and again and again. It starts off with the teaching of Jesus and the apostles, and as it begins to expand, then there are variations of teaching that eventually are judged to be outside the camp. Already in one of the earliest documents in the New Testament, Paul's letter to the Galatians, he is dealing with another gospel that is really no gospel at all. That's because there was already an accepted gospel, and now something is distorting it, and he begins to challenge it. And as the challenges become more and more and more diverse, you get into the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and you begin to see claims of things that are very far removed from what you find in the New Testament. If somebody doubts this, all they really have to do is compare, let's say, the Gospel of Peter with the Gospel of Mark. I'd strongly suggest that people read the two documents and see if they sound alike, if they're talking about the same things, if they're heading in the same direction. And you quickly see that that's not the case. I think there's one other thing that needs to be said. We speak today of the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of John. And there are some people of more skeptical persuasion that think that this suggests there were different messages, there were different Gospels, there were different teachings. There was a Markan teaching and a Lucan teaching and a Johannine teaching and so forth, and they can't really be fit together. But that's not what the earliest documents call them. In all of the earliest documents, it's the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, and so forth. So it's the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the one Gospel, according to different witnesses with different slants, different emphases, and this sort of thing that coalesce in a variety of ways. And so it's no surprise that all four canonical Gospels, as we refer to them, the one Gospel of Jesus Christ according to four different authors, they all have a certain kind of similarity of structure too. You begin with the origins of Jesus Christ. You mention John the Baptist. You go through periods of Jesus' ministry, his teaching, sayings, with different emphases, admittedly, until ultimately there's a drive toward Christ's death and resurrection. So the gospel of Jesus Christ is this message about who Jesus is, what he said and taught, and then his death and resurrection and what it means. That's the gospel of Jesus Christ. So you come to something like the so-called Gospel of Thomas. It's not a gospel. It's almost certainly mid-2nd century. But in any case, it doesn't have any of the storyline. It's 114 separate sayings with 3 little snippets of narrative that don't take you to the passion and resurrection of Christ. It's not a gospel. And that fundamental distinction simply has to be acknowledged, or the history is distorted.